Chapter 11. The Family and Property Relations. 1. The shift from matriarchy to the patriarchal family. In the deep twilight of human prehistory, long before the first surveyor's stake was driven into the earth, the family was not an island of private ownership, but a wide, flowing river of communal kinship. In this era of the gens, the clan, lineage was almost universally traced through the mother, a system known as matriarchy, mother right. Because the land was common and the tribe moved as one, there was no private estate to pass down. Children were the children of the tribe, and women, as the givers of life and the primary gatherers, held a position of central social and spiritual authority. However, as the great theft of land occurred and wealth began to accumulate in the hands of individual men through cattle herding and early agriculture, a profound and violent social revolution took place. Friedrich Engels famously termed this transition the world historical defeat of the female sex. This shift wasn't driven by a change in human nature, but by the cold, relentless logic of the fence. Once a man claimed a piece of the earth, a herd of oxen, or a cache of grain as his exclusive property, he developed a new, obsessive psychological need, the desire for biological immortality through assets. He wanted to ensure that the wealth he had accumulated didn't return to the communal tribe upon his death, but stayed within his specific bloodline. To achieve this, the communal freedom of the old matrilineal world had to be dismantled. The woman was essentially enclosed within the private home, much like the common pastures were being enclosed by the rising nobility. Her movement, her social interactions, and most importantly, her reproductive capacity became subjects of intense male regulation. The family was no longer a unit of mutual affection and tribal cohesion. It became a legal fortress for the protection of the estate. The father emerged as the paterfamilias, not merely a parent, but a proprietor of the hearth, and the mother was relegated to the guardian of the heir. This was the moment when the private home was born, not as a sanctuary of love, but the geographic territory where a man's property was managed and his lineage was secured. The fall of matriarchy was the first great act of privatization in human history. It turned the woman into the first domestic possession of the property-holding male, creating a hierarchy where the master of the house and the owner of the land became one and the same. The love of the child was now inextricably tied to the love of the inheritance, and the family tree became a map of a man's holdings. 2. The breeding of heirs for property accumulation. In the wake of the patriarchal revolution, the biological act of procreation was slowly strangled by the economic necessity of accumulation. Children were no longer welcomed simply as new voices in the tribal chorus or as extra hands for the common harvest. They were viewed through the cold, calculated lens of succession. In this new era, the family became a biological machine, a living trust, designed with the sole purpose of keeping the estate intact and expanding it across the centuries. The crib was no longer a place of mere parental joy, but the starting point of a legal ledger. The eldest son, in particular, was elevated to a nearly sacred status. Yet this elevation was rarely born of pure paternal love. He was the vessel of the property. Through the legal custom of primogeniture, the right of the firstborn, the entire family fortune was funneled into a single male heir. The sprawling lands, the ancient titles, the manors, the liquid capital. This was a strategic move of ruthless efficiency. It prevented the fragmentation of the land into smaller, less powerful plots. The family's strength lay in the size and continuity of its acreage, and the heir was the structural glue that held that power together. To divide the land among all children was seen as a form of economic suicide. To give it to one was to ensure the dynasty's survival. This breeding for property turned the household into a corporate office where blood was the currency. Younger sons, denied a share of the soil, were often treated as redundant spare parts. They were pushed into the clergy, the colonial administration, the military, essentially exported to serve the interests of the family from afar without draining the central estate. Daughters were rarely seen as individuals with agency or desires. Instead, they were diplomatic currency, traded in the marriage markets of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie to merge two neighboring estates, to settle long-standing debts between rival dynasties, or to inject fresh capital into a decaying noble line. In this nightmare, the child was not an independent human being, but a link in a chain of ownership. Every birth was a calculation of assets. Every death was a legal crisis. The sanctity of the family often served as a velvet glove for the iron fist of the ledger, where the preservation of the family name was synonymous with the preservation of the family's wealth. To fail to produce a legitimate male heir was seen as more than a personal tragedy. It was a bankruptcy of the bloodline. The family had become a tool for the land, rather than the land being a tool for the family.
3. Monogamy as an economic contract, not a union of souls. One of the most provocative and sharpest arguments made by 19th century social critics was that monogamy, in its modern legal and social form, was born not from a sudden surge of moral enlightenment or spiritual devotion, but from the cold structural demands of private property. While the Romantic poets of the Victorian era sang of the union of souls and eternal metaphysical destiny, the jurists and the patriarchs were focused on a far more visceral and practical matter: the certainty of paternity and the tight consolidation of titles. Before the fence was driven into the earth in the communal world of the gens, the question of who sired whom was of secondary importance. Children were the pulse of the tribe. They were fed from the common pot and belonged to the collective. But the moment the earth was divided into private estates, an illegitimate child was no longer just a human being. It was a catastrophic legal leak in the family's wealth. To allow a child of uncertain origin into the family line was to risk the contamination of the estate and the dilution of the master's accumulated power. Thus, the woman's fidelity was enforced not to protect her honor, but to protect the ledger. Monogamy was in essence the first exclusive contract of the private era. It granted the husband monopoly rights over the woman's body to ensure that no intruder could plant a seed in his private garden. The marriage ceremony became the signing of a deed, and the wedding veil was the first enclosure. This turned marriage into a commercial transaction, where the dowry served as the entry price for a merger of fortunes. In the upper classes, it was a corporate merger, where two sprawling acreages were joined together to create a more formidable power block. In the lower classes, it was a partnership for survival, a way to pool meager resources. In both cases, the soul of the union was often the soil or the capital described in the contract. This strips away the romantic veneer of the family to reveal that the monogamous household was the domestic mirror of the private factory, a controlled, high-stakes environment where the owner ensured that the product, the heir, was authentic, unadulterated, and legally qualified to carry the dead weight of property into the future. 4. The exclusion of women from social production. As property shifted from the communal tribe to the individual male proprietor, the role of women underwent a radical and restrictive transformation. In the pre-property communal era, women were central to social production. They were the primary gatherers, the early cultivators, the master weavers, whose labor was visible, public, and vital to the collective survival. However, with the rise of the patriarchal estate, the woman was systematically withdrawn from the public square and enclosed within the domestic sphere. This exclusion wasn't a matter of biological capability, but a direct consequence of the need to protect the lineage.
To ensure the purity of the bloodline, and thus the security of the inheritance, the woman had to be removed from the uncontrolled public marketplace and the shared fields, where she might interact freely with the community. She was placed within the home, a space that was increasingly privatized and cut off from the economic life of the village. Within these walls, her labor was no longer seen as a contribution to society. It became a private service to the husband. Her work, cooking, cleaning, and rearing the next generation of owners, was devalued because it didn't directly produce capital, rent, or titles that could be recorded in a ledger. This created a state of total economic dependency. Because the woman couldn't own the land she worked or the house she maintained, she became a propertyless person living within a property-owning family. Her legal status in many systems was reduced to that of a perpetual minor, moving from the guardianship of her father to the guardianship of her husband. By excluding women from the broader economy, the property system ensured that they remained domestic prisoners of the family unit. They were transformed from autonomous producers into consumers and stewards of the male's wealth, unable to survive without the protection of the patriarch who held the keys to the granary. This was the domestic enclosure that mirrored the enclosure of the fields, a fence built around the life and agency of half of humanity to ensure that the great estate remained untainted and undivided.
5. Heredity in direct and collateral succession. The final and most resilient layer of the family property bond is the complex, often labyrinthine legal web of heredity. Succession was never merely the emotional passing of a family home from a father to a grieving son. It was a sophisticated legal technology, a ghostly machine designed to prevent wealth from ever escaping back into the hands of the community. It functioned as the ultimate weapon against the redistribution of the earth, ensuring that even in death, the proprietor's hand remained clenched around his holdings through the legal fiction of the bloodline. The law made a sharp, critical distinction between direct succession from parent to child and collateral succession to brothers, cousins, or even distant nephews. In the ancient world of the communal gens, the death of an individual was a moment of release. Their personal tools or effects might return to the tribe or be buried with them, as the land they walked was already common. But under the regime of private property, death became a high-stakes legal transfer. The law began to hunt with mechanical precision for any biological relative to claim the assets, no matter how distant. This obsession with heredity turned every relative into a potential claimant or rival, giving rise to what critics called a vulture culture of inheritance. The bedbed became a theater of intense legal maneuvering, where the reading of the will replaced the communal mourning of the soul. Under the rules of collateral succession, the law would rather grant 10,000 acres to a wealthy, distant cousin living 3 provinces away, someone who has never even seen the land, than allow it to be redistributed to the local, landless peasants whose sweat actually nourished that soil. By prioritizing the purity of the bloodline over the justice of the work, the state ensured that property stayed clotted within specific dynasties for centuries. This prevented the natural breathing of resources, the process by which wealth would naturally disperse back to the people over generations. Instead, it created a permanent class of inheritors who owned the earth not because they worked it, nor because they bought it, but because they shared a fragment of DNA with a conqueror or an encloser from a forgotten century. Heredity thus became the anchor of structural inequality, effectively sealing the commons forever through the ironclad laws of blood, bone, and the parchment of the dead. It transformed the planet into a graveyard of ancient titles, where the living are perpetually forced to pay rent to the ghosts of the past.